Welcome to the Manly Saints Project with me, Hugh Hunter. If you enjoy my work, please consider signing up and supporting me on Substack, or click the link in the show notes to buy me a beer. And if you enjoy the podcast as audio or video, please consider giving me a rating wherever you are. It helps a lot. Now, let's meet this week's Manly Saint. Join me today to meet the spectacularly unsuccessful murderer who became one of the greatest saints of late antiquity. Name: Germain, Germanus of Auxerre. Life: 378 to 448 AD. Status: Saint. Feast: July 31st. This time, the bishop had gone too far. He had deeply, personally offended the governor of Gallia, of Gaul as we would say today, and now the bishop would have to die. Clearly, the bishop had suspected this, because he had conveniently slipped away after his crime. His mistake had been coming back. Now that he was back, easy to find in the cathedral, the governor rounded up a few armed men and went to show the bishop what happened to those who crossed him. When the governor and his men got to the church, they found the doors open and everyone else going in. Apparently, the bishop had an announcement to tell everybody. It would have been strange for the governor not to go and hear the announcement, so he and his men stashed their weapons outside the church and went in to hear what the bishop had to say. The crowd eagerly waited to hear the bishop's news. Once the church was full, priests carefully closed the doors, and the bishop pointed at the governor and told his priests and deacons to seize him. They dragged the now unarmed governor to the front of the church, and although the governor and his men were unarmed, the same could not be said for the bishop, who drew a knife from his robes, grabbed a handful of the kneeling governor's hair, and began to take his strange revenge. And yet, all was not as it appeared there in Auxerre, centrally located in modern France, in the early 5th century AD. In time, both men would be recognized as saints: the bishop, Bishop Amator of Auxerre, and the man who had come there to kill him, the Roman governor Germain. But at the time, the only one in the church who understood what was happening was Bishop Amator, and he only knew because God had revealed it to him. And even Amator could hardly guess at the wonderful destiny awaiting the kneeling men before him. The conflict between the bishop and the governor had begun because the bishop had been an obstacle to the governor, and Germain was used to getting his own way. It wasn't that Germain was spoiled or entitled. Rather, he was good at everything he did. He came from a good family, and his parents had sent him to Rome to study rhetoric and law. He had done so well that he was soon one of the most highly sought-after lawyers in the province of Gaul. He had done so well as a lawyer that he was chosen to serve the Roman Empire as governor of the region. Governor was a civil appointment, but there is evidence that Germain also held the military rank of dux, source of our word duke, commanding the regional forces of the empire. It was a difficult time to be in charge. A previous emperor had invited the massive migrating group of the Visigoths to cross the Danube into Roman territory in the hope of using them as cheap labor. Instead, the Visigoths had rampaged through the empire. The Visigoths eventually came to the city of Rome, sacking it in 410 AD. Even though the emperors had retreated to their fortress city of Ravenna in the north of Italy, no one could quite believe that Rome had been so humiliated after so many centuries of power. The notoriously tough Saint Jerome wept when he heard the news. But up in Gaul, Germain had managed to keep things a little more stable. The Visigoths moved on, and the emperor re-established some kind of control. Meanwhile, Germain had time for fun along with work, and one of his great pleasures was the hunt. Germain was good at hunting, as he was at most things, and he took to hanging the particularly impressive heads of animals he had killed in a large tree in the middle of Auxerre. The pagan Celts had done the same, sometimes leaving the remains of sacrificed animals in their sacred trees. There's no evidence that Germain was trying to resurrect these old pagan rituals. He was probably just proud of his kills. But the Bishop of Auxerre, Amator, grew worried. The sack of Rome had shaken everyone so profoundly that it had caused a minor pagan revival, as people wondered whether the eternal city had fallen because its old gods had been abandoned. Down in Roman Africa, St. Augustine was already working on a book to explain that Christians were citizens of an eternal city, but it was the city of God and not temporal Rome. Bishop Amator tried to make Germain understand that this was not the moment to toy with pagan ritual. Germain ignored him. And so, when the governor was away, Bishop Amator did what St. Boniface would do in the coming centuries. He took an axe and chopped down the tree, then threw Germain's trophies into the garbage. When Germain heard what had been done, he was furious and decided to kill Amator. Amator had wisely slipped out of town. Germain did not know it, but angry as he was still only the bishop's second biggest headache. The biggest problem on the bishop's mind was succession. Amator was old, and he prayed that Auxerre would be in good hands after his time. Now he asked God to keep him alive long enough to find an heir. And the answer to the bishop's prayers, when it came, had led the surprised old man to return to his cathedral and gather the people together to hear an announcement. Then, when everyone was gathered together, Amator had told his clerics to drag the struggling governor to the front of the church. They held Germain while Amator cut his hair to give him the tonsure, the shaved head characteristic of clerics. Amator made Germain a deacon, and then made the surprise announcement to the people. The struggling man before them was Amator's heir, the next bishop of Auxerre. Amator's actions had not exactly been canonically correct, and under different circumstances Germain could have protested that he hadn't agreed to any of it. But Amator had been acting on faith, and now Germain was struck with a powerful sense of vocation. Deacon Germain set his affairs in order and gave up his governorship. He spoke to his wife, and she understood and agreed. Germain had been someone who enjoyed the pleasures of life, but almost overnight he became known for his ascetic lifestyle. Soon afterward, Amator died, and by then Germain had been ordained a priest and was ready to take Amator's place as Bishop of Auxerre. After Bishop Germain's death, the man who took his place as Bishop of Auxerre asked Constantius of Lyon to write the story of his famous predecessor. Constantius tells us that we ought not to find it too tedious to read through what Christ did not find it too tedious to do for us. Christ, who, when he gives glory to his saints, is giving an invitation to us. And with this defense, even though he insists that he has left out more than he includes, Constantius unleashes a torrent of stories from the saint's life. Germain was good at taking charge. Auxerre flourished, and he traveled through his lands, checking in on the priests under his jurisdiction. Germain preached the word and healed the sick. He cast out demons. The reader soon has the sense that Constantius is so confident of the case for Germain's sainthood that he includes some stories for the sheer joy of their strangeness. There's the time that Germain encountered and dealt with a poltergeist, laying the unquiet spirit to rest. Or the time that Germain's intervention was a little too helpful. One family kept chickens, but for some reason their roosters had stopped crowing, and they disliked the new, melancholy silence of the mornings. Germain blessed the chicken feed, and the family immediately realized their mistake when the roosters began crowing so much that, They wearied the ears of the household almost to distraction by their constant crowing. Under Germain's energetic leadership, Auxerre was doing well. But more broadly, the church was struggling with the Pelagian heresy, and in Britain, the heresy was spreading. The Britons asked for help, and their fellow Celts in Gaul could think of no finer envoy than Germain. And so, around 429, Germain and a few others undertook the dangerous sea voyage to Britain. Once there, Germain began going from place to place, healing the sick, helping locals, but also debating and correcting the Pelagians. Soon, the Pelagian heresy was being pushed back. In his Pelagian drinking song in praise of Saint Germain and also of beer, Hilaire Belloc offers a dramatic retelling of how it all worked out. And with his stout episcopal staff, so thoroughly whacked and banged the heretics all, both short and tall, they'd rather had been hanged. Even if Belloc oversells the drama of the fight against the Pelagians a little, he leaves out the much more dramatic events that happened next. Germain arrived in one village as Lent was coming to an end. The people were eager to hear him, but they were also keeping an eye on a group of raiders camped out across a nearby river. For a very long time, Britain had been a Roman province. But then, 20 years before, word had come that Rome no longer had the capacity to defend the island. The Britons were on their own. They were being relentlessly raided by the Picts, who lived in modern Scotland, and by an unfamiliar Germanic people identifiable from the distinctive long knives or perhaps short swords called seaxes that they carried, the Saxons. This expedition was a joint Saxon-Pictish raid, and the raiders were just sitting there, as if they were waiting for something. In a few days, Easter came. Many of the soldiers of the village were baptized. And no sooner had this happened than they got word that the raiders had crossed the river and were on the move. It turned out that they understood their Christian enemies well enough to know that Easter was the greatest of the Christian feasts. The pagan raiders were hoping to take the Britons unaware. When word came that the pagans were approaching, Bishop Germain took command of the situation. He might be there to baptize and refute the Pelagians, but his tactical eye had still registered a valley through which the raiders were certain to approach. Germain organized the defenders and led them, still wet from baptism, as Constantius says, to take up positions surrounding this valley. The raiders advanced, assuming that the Christians would be oblivious, occupied with their Easter rituals. When the raiders were entirely in the valley, Germain gave the signal. Someone shouted Allelujah, and everyone else joined in, the Allelujah echoing back and forth from both sides of the valley. The raiders hesitated. Those of them with a good eye for terrain must have realized that they were in the worst possible situation, vulnerable to attack from both sides against enemies who held the high ground. A few of the raiders turned and ran, and that provoked a panicked retreat as all of them tried to get out of the valley. The raiders sprinted to be the first to their boats, tossing their heavy equipment to move faster and overcrowding the river ford so that many of them were swept away in the current. Germain's soldiers followed them at a casual pace, picking up the valuable equipment they found discarded on the way. Christians were inspired by this victory, the Allelujah victory, as it came to be called, in which Germain had somehow prevailed without even lifting a weapon. Tradition has it that the Britons immediately put him to work, consolidating their defenses and perhaps, in some versions of the story, helping the great defender of the island, that elusive figure known as King Arthur. Soon the Pelagian heresy was mostly contained, and Germain was able to return to Gaul and put his energy into his home. This is the setting for my favorite story of Saint Germain. When he was traveling in Gaul, he met a man who was cold and begging. Germain invited the man to join his camp and eat with him and his clerics. The man warmed himself at the fire and ate their food, but that night he stole Germain's horse and snuck away with it. The next day, the man came up to Germain's party bringing back the horse. He reported that try though he might, he simply could not leave the area, with or without it. Finally, he decided to bring it back and beg this strange bishop's forgiveness. But Germain surprised his companions by telling the man that no, it was he who was sorry. He gave the man a warm cloak. If yesterday we had given you the clothing you lacked, you would not have been reduced to stealing. Now take this that you need and restore what is ours. These were the last years of the Western Roman Empire, and in such chaotic times, a man like Germain seemed to be needed everywhere. He was called back to Britain to help again. Then he was called to Armorica, in modern Brittany in the west of France, to make the case for mercy with the barbarian group moving into the area, the Alans. Germain went to speak with the king, who was riding toward Armorica at the head of his forces. The king tried to ride on by the bishop and his delegation, and Germain broke with protocol by riding up to the king, grabbing the bridle of his horse, and telling him to stop and listen. After a moment of shocked silence, the king told his generals that stopping had in fact been his idea, and they were going to make camp there. The king and the bishop had a long conversation, and the king agreed to what the bishop was asking. Bishop Germain was a celebrity. He used his fame to preach, but also to train, bringing promising young clerics like the young St. Patrick into his entourage and preparing them to go out on their own. And Bishop Germain had an eye for holiness wherever he went. On one of his journeys, Germain had stopped to speak to a 7-year-old girl, giving her a small medal with a cross on it, saying that she would be a holy person. She was the future Saint Geneviève, the great patroness of Paris. Soon, Bishop Germain was called to Italy. By now, many of the villages that Germain went through knew him, and much of the journey became a preaching tour. But crossing the Alps was difficult. The bishop traveled in a group that had people from all walks of life, and Germain insisted on helping the old and the weak by carrying their packs, and sometimes carrying them too. By the time Bishop Germain arrived in Italy, his clothes no longer looked like those of a bishop. He passed into one town without anyone even noticing him, and perhaps no one would have, except that Germain happened to walk by a man who was suffering from demonic possession, and the demon lost its cool and shouted, "Germanus, why do you pursue us into Italy? Be content that you have driven us out of Gaul. Be content that your prayers have defeated both us and the ocean. Why do you scour the whole world? Take a rest, and let us have a rest ourselves." And so, of course, people began to realize that this weary traveler was the Bishop Germain of whom so much had been heard. Germain cast out the noisy demon, and his trip continued. Germain was headed to Ravenna. The city was surrounded by watery land that made it hard to attack, and it was the last defensive position of the emperors of the Western Roman Empire. In the city, Germain continued to work miraculous healings. On one occasion, the empress tried to honor him by sending him a silver tray laden with vegetarian dishes. Since becoming a deacon, Germain had not eaten meat. Germain gave the fine food to the poor and chopped up the silver plate to give it to them as well. He sent the empress back a small loaf on a plain wood plate. The empress understood that Germain had been her collaborator in giving alms to the poor, and she was delighted. She had the wooden plate set in gold, one of the most prized possessions that she owned. Germain was there at Ravenna when he had a dream. He dreamt about Jesus. In the dream, Jesus was helping Germain do what he had done many times before, which was to prepare for a journey. Germain asked him where he would be going this time. In the dream, Jesus said, "Do not be afraid. I'm not sending you on your travels again, but to your fatherland, where you will have quiet and eternal rest." Germain made his few preparations. He told the empress very specifically that he did not want to be buried at Ravenna. He wanted his body taken back to Auxerre. A few days after the dream, Germain died. Constantius describes the frantic scramble for relics that followed the saint's death. Saint Germain had said that he wanted his body sent back to his home of Auxerre, so that was off limits. He hadn't mentioned his things, and the empress snagged some, as did senior members of the church. And then, in a more decorous way, they set about honoring Saint Germain's last request. The emperor and the church organized a huge procession, carrying the incorrupt body on the long, long walk back to Auxerre. No one knew it yet, but this was among the last big events to take place in the Western Roman Empire. Soon the West would fall, and Saint Germain's students would go out into the fragmented world of the Dark Ages. But now, many joined this last grand pilgrimage to take the saint back home. Constantius tells the story, recording the healings and miracles that took place along the way. When the procession arrived in Piacenza, a little southeast of Milan, a woman who was paralyzed asked her family to carry her into the church where the body was kept overnight. She stayed there to pray for Saint Germain's intercession. And in the morning, as Constantius reports, the woman who had been paralyzed stood up and joined the procession as it moved on toward the north.